Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to another video. Today I would like to give you all another lesson. We're going to be talking about identifying weaknesses. There are a lot of different types of weaknesses, so I thought I would stretch things out into several videos covering one topic at a time. The first one is going to be the one that is probably the easiest to immediately understand from a visual perspective because, well, it's just the classification of certain things. And what are those things? If you've read the title of the video, you probably know it's pawns. So if you see pawns that are structured in a certain way, there's going to be weaknesses, and knowing that is extremely useful because if you understand what the weakness is and how the weakness works when you look at different classifications of them, then that can actually help you greatly in improving. So now you should see a position on your screen, and don't worry about anything like specific. Just these three things that you see are classifications of different types of weaknesses. And we should start with the first group, which is this one. I'm sure you guys know what the classification would be here. It's the doubled pawn. So when you have doubled pawns like this, the problem is it could lead to less space. It could mean pawn endings are bad for you. But it could also mean there's more open lines. So sometimes there can be strengths, but that's a whole lesson in its own, finding strengths and weaknesses. That's probably what the name will be of it. But for the purpose of this one, we're going to be more so focusing on how it can be a weakness. And again, it's mainly with creating less mobility for black when it comes to certain squares they cover, or making pawn breaks effectively can be quite troubling. The next potential weakness is one that white has here. And the one that white has is the c2 pawn. This is the backward pawn. Whenever you see pawns like this that also have maybe a pawn here, or that are just at the bottom of a chain, whenever you see pawns connected like this, you might immediately notice that, well, c2 is actually weak. You can imagine something coming to c8, like a rook, maybe even a knight to b4, and this pawn might drop, depending on the positions, of course. So being aware of backward pawns, essentially pawns that begin a pawn chain, is very important and can actually tell you where to play and why. So we'll be looking at examples of that. The last one is the isolated pawn, which is this pawn on g2. The pawn on g2, of course, because it's isolated, it does also have other problems. One of them is that it can be attacked, for example, again, with a rook or a queen, really anything. It can move forward, however, so one of the best ways to attack the pawn is actually to attack the square in front of it, making sure it can't push forward, and then attacking the pawn, trying to win the pawn, essentially. So those are the three classifications we'll be discussing today. And now we kind of have to go into more detail. So the first thing we should look at is the doubled pawn. So let's do that. All right, and now we have our first example, and it's the doubled pawn. So there's two imbalances in the position. The first imbalance is the quality of the pawns. Black has a damaged structure and white does not. And also, there's a majority on opposite sides of the board. Here, white actually has the ability to make a pass pawn with e6. However, black does not have that same opportunity. If black were to try to make some sort of pass pawn, it just doesn't work. And the way that white can avoid it is actually by playing moves like c3 and a3. There's only one trick. So after f4, let's just go through a line of c5, king f2, b5, g4, a5, king to e3, king to e7. We're not focused too much on the accuracy here because we're just trying to illustrate how the pawns may move and try to create some play. So this would be potentially a scary scenario where we allow a4 and all of a sudden b3 is actually a threat. And we'd have to play b3 ourselves. Luckily, still actually totally fine, because after b3, our king's just going to come over and win the pawns. But again, we're ignoring the king placement for the sake of understanding the pawn breaks here. So instead, after b4, you could just play c3. And after c3, if c5 to defend b4, you just go a3. And all of a sudden, there's absolutely nothing that black can do. These pawns are completely immobilized. If you ever take either way, then you just recapture. And after captures, what you can see is this pawn stops both of these. However, white still has this pawn break of f5 and e6. Again, we're trying to ignore the fact that the king could just win these pawns right away. So yeah, of course, because of this, sometimes you're going to end up in scenarios where king and pawn endings you just can't go into because they're just losing, because pawn breaks are going to be hard to make. So being aware of that is extremely important. Okay, and now we have pretty much almost the exact same position. The only difference here is that instead of the pawn on e5, it's on d4. And this actually makes all the difference. And that's because, well, there's actually not a pawn break to make anymore. But there are still potential problems for black. And the way they can try to resolve them is by playing c5 and getting rid of that pawn. Of course, not sacrificing it, but simply trading it off. For example, bringing the king to d6 and then playing the move c5. So the goal here is for white to potentially prevent this move c5. That is a good idea. But mainly it's also just to restrict. The job here is a little bit different because, well, now we're looking at moves like b4 and we're playing less of a active role and more of a prophylactic one, where if we can play something like b4, c5 is going to be harder to get. And that's actually something really important to keep in mind. You have to be careful, especially in these types of endings, of playing something like b4. You never know if you weaken the light squares too much after something like b5 yourself. But again, we're not too focused on the specifics, calculating these types of endings to be specific. We're looking at the strategic themes going on here. So because this pawn is also on d4 and this pawn is on c6, it also means that white has more control over the center. As we can see, e5 is covered by this d pawn, whereas this pawn, which was once on d7, which could go to d5, is now on c6. And because of that, it actually controls a little bit less space taken away from the center. You could make an argument that, hey, if, for example, a takes b6 was played instead, then that would have been a bit more optimal, getting more central control. But generally, one of the issues is now it's going to be harder to mobilize these pawns. For example, one thing you'd love to play is some sort of d5 and c6. But now, because the pawn's on c6, you can't play c5, c6. Without at least preparing c5. So it takes you a little bit longer to get those moves in. But of course, black should be totally fine, especially after getting a move like c5, trading off their doubled pawn. Okay, on to the next one. This is the isolated pawn, and probably the one people know the best. So the isolated pawn is interesting where it can be a weakness or a strength. And of course, because we're talking about weaknesses, we're going to discuss it specifically as a weakness. Here we see an isolated queen pawn, a very common type of pawn structure where, well, what are the goals? The goal for black is actually, of course, to trade the pawn off. And generally, if they do win a middle game, they can easily find themselves with more space. However, if the pawn cannot be traded off, it is a huge weakness and liability because, well, the isolated pawn is when a pawn is not on either side. So here the problem is, since it cannot be defended by pawns, what does it have to be defended by? Pieces. And if pieces have to defend this pawn, then all of a sudden you are forcing yourself into some sort of passivity. And this could end up being completely decisive in some cases. And that's, of course, something you want to avoid. So keeping that in mind, one of the ways to punish the isolated pawn is actually simply mainly to prevent them from pushing it and trading it off. That's the biggest thing you want to avoid. Next, after, for example, a knight A knight would be perfect on d4, but sometimes a knight isn't always possible to get there. If it's a rook ending, rook, like 2 rooks versus 2 rooks or whatever, getting a rook on d4 would be nice, or a bishop on d4. What you want to, again, avoid is mainly just black being able to facilitate the d4 break, or if the pawn is somewhere else and isolated, you want to avoid them being able to trade it off. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, so I'm sure you can find positions where it's not good to trade the pawn off, but in this case, that is black's dream goal. So yeah, keeping that in mind, again, isolated pawns, they're weak because they cannot be defended by other pawns, which is what you would prefer. And also, they're weak because, well, the squares in front of them are extremely weak. Here we can see that, well, because there's no pawns on the E or C file, how are these squares going to be covered? They have to be covered by black's pieces. Or if white were kind of silly enough to get black to be able to recapture towards this D pawn in order to no longer make it isolated. So keep that in mind when you are playing these positions. And now we're on to the final classification. And this one can be sometimes the trickiest one. Of course, when we see 2 pawns on the same file, we know that they're doubled. When we see a pawn with no pawns beside it, we know that that is a isolated pawn. But for backward pawns, it can be tricky to know when they're weak or not. And the way we should look at it is really, a weakness is something that is easy to attack, right? Even with the last 2 examples, an isolated pawn, if it can trade itself off quickly, or if there's not really any danger of you attacking it, then is it really such a weakness? And it's the same thing here. So right now, when you look at the position, you might say, okay, the backward pawns are g2 and c7, right? When we look at the center, generally you want to look at the central structures first here. You might notice that black has a backward pawn on c7 and white has one on g2. So the way to weaken them and get something out of it is actually to make a pawn break. And here what we want to do is, well, c7 is kind of hard to attack, especially if we have a pawn on c2. You might be aware of this position or the ones before. These are all from very popular openings, and that was intentional. I wanted to show positions or pawn structures from openings that you probably know and give these analyses of them. So here, one of white's best plans is to make a pawn break on the side that they have more space. And the same is the case for black. White's best plan is to play some sort of c5 and trade on d6. c7 can be a weak pawn, but you really want the c pawn gone so you can bring pieces to the c file. That will give you an avenue to attack it, and therefore it will be a weakness. In order to do that, you do kind of need to get rid of your c pawn, but you don't want to lose it, you want to trade it off. For black, well, it's a little bit more complicated sometimes, going for the king generally with f5, and sometimes f4 with g5 and g4 coming. So, for example, after c4, f5, b4, f4, we see c5, g5, takes and takes. And black will probably follow up with some sort of h5 and g4. The positions get extremely messy in these King's Indian structures and positions. But now what we're looking at is all of a sudden what white has done is white has transformed the weakness from the c7 pawn to the d6 pawn. And what you can do is, hey, even though you can't make another c pawn break, which would have been really nice, you can now target this pawn on d6. And when you transform the weakness into something that's closer to the center, sometimes that actually gets really uncomfortable. Because if this d6 pawn were to fall, for example, if the c pawn fell, it might not be the end of the world if it was just taken off the board. However, if this d6 pawn falls, that's the end of the world for sure. Because then this e5 pawn's probably going to fall. g4 gets harder to play because f4 is even harder to defend. So everything in the structure becomes weaker as a result, and it's no different for white. For example, if white were to be a little bit more passive here, and allow h5 and g4. You might see, for example, even h3 in these positions, trying to prevent it even further. But of course, we need a piece covering this g4 square. But generally there is with a light squared bishop. But you go g4 anyways and open up the king side. And because black has more space over here, this can actually benefit them when some pieces start getting traded. Lines get opened up against the white king. And because there's more space over there, black can actually consider themselves to be preferred because, well, they have more space to maneuver their pieces, whereas white doesn't really have that option. So keeping that in mind for when you're trying to look for ways to create these pawn breaks, you want to look at generally where the backward pawn is. And generally there's most likely almost always going to be one, even when it looks like there isn't. And finding those types of breaks, making sure you're not creating those weaknesses for yourself, like an isolated pawn or a doubled pawn, as well, is a nice luxury if you can afford it. But of course, creating these backward pawns to attack, for example, again, this d6 pawn, you can imagine a knight going to b5 or a knight going to c4 in these types of positions, and it can be quite difficult to defend d6. And in return, even though in this position black is less likely trying to win the f3 pawn, they are opening lines against the white king. So strategically, it's still a nice thing for them to do, to try to attack that that backward pawn, or at least bring it closer to the center. Because again, all these types of trades, excuse me, let's just play a5. All these types of trades, bringing the pawns closer to the center, can be a bit more comfortable for the side that has to do it. After g takes on f3, we can see more lines opened up towards both kings. And again, since black would have more space there, could be better for them. But again, same thing for white. After c takes and c takes, here it's a similar situation because, well, after c takes and c takes, the c file is opened up and it's easier to bring knights over to b5, c4, maybe even push and bring a bishop to a3. There's lots of avenues to attack and get a lot of activity. So, of course, being aware of those plans is extremely important. All right, and that's going to cover it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed and hopefully learned something, even though this was more of a theoretical type of video talking about theoretical ways in which pawns can be weak. It's mainly because there's only 3 classifications and we only really need to understand how to exploit these weaknesses. And we could look at game examples, but this would be quite a long video. So if you guys did enjoy, maybe I will actually show specific games in which each of those weaknesses are exploited. That could be something of use to you guys. Let me know if you would like that. But next week we will be going over a different identification of weaknesses, which is piece coordination and development. So pieces, we looked at pawns. Next, we'll look at pieces, and after that, we'll look at the king. There'll be a full part just on the king because, well, that is sometimes actually really tricky to evaluate correctly. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.